Before love had rules, before it had sides, before it started asking me to choose who mattered more, there was just my son and me. I remember the nights I stayed awake listening to his breathing, afraid that if I closed my eyes for even a second, something terrible might happen. I remember learning the language of his cries before I ever learned how to rest. Hunger, fear, bad dreams. I could tell the difference without thinking. I built my life around him without calling it sacrifice. Because when you're a mother, love doesn't feel heavy. It feels necessary. I was there for every version of him. The shy child who hid behind my legs. The angry teenager who slammed doors but still needed dinner on the table. The young man who pretended he didn't need me but always called when life got complicated. I wasn't perfect. I made mistakes. I said the wrong things sometimes. But I loved him in a way that didn't ask for anything back. When he moved out, I told myself it was natural. Children grow. They build their own lives. That's how it's supposed to be. I believed love was something that expanded, that it made room, that it didn't replace it added. I never imagined that one day, loving him would feel like standing outside a door I used to own the key to. Back then, when he hugged me goodbye, he held on for an extra second, as if he knew something was changing, even if neither of us could name it yet. If I had known that would be the beginning of distance, I would have held on longer. When he met her, I tried to be careful with my happiness. I smiled without asking too many questions. I listened more than I spoke. I told myself this was not my place to interfere, this was his life now. And I truly wanted him to be happy. At first, nothing felt wrong. He still called me, still asked my opinion on small things, still showed up for dinner, sometimes late, sometimes tired, but always familiar. She would sit across from me at the table, polite, reserved, watching more than speaking. I thought maybe she was just shy. I welcomed her the only way I knew how, by making space. I cooked her favorite meals once I learned them. I defended her when relatives made careless comments. I told my son he was lucky, and I meant it. But slowly, something shifted. The calls became shorter. The visits became scheduled. The warmth in his voice changed. When I asked simple questions, "How are you? Are you both okay?" His answers felt rehearsed, as if he was checking what was safe to say. Once, I mentioned a memory from his childhood. She laughed lightly and said, "He doesn't really talk about that stuff anymore." It wasn't cruel. It wasn't loud. But it was final. I told myself I was imagining things. Mothers do that. Sometimes we fear being left behind, so we see ghosts where there are none. Still, I felt it. Like I was being slowly edited out of a story I helped write. I didn't realize then that love was being redefined around me. That soon, my presence would feel like an inconvenience instead of a comfort. I was still included, but I was no longer central. And I didn't know how quickly that would change everything. Distance doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes, it slips in quietly, so softly that by the time you notice, it's already rearranged everything. He stopped calling just to talk. Now, when the phone rang, there was always a reason, a question, a problem, something practical. Never me. I told myself this was adulthood. People get busy. Lives fill up. Love doesn't disappear just because time changes shape. But I missed the way he used to say my name. Now it felt rushed, trimmed down, like something he needed to get through quickly. When I visited, I noticed I no longer knew where things were in his house. The kitchen felt unfamiliar. The couch wasn't where I remembered. Even the photos on the walls had changed. There were pictures of them everywhere. Smiling, traveling, celebrating moments I hadn't been told about. I stood there, holding my purse, unsure where to sit, unsure where I fit. Once, I gently suggested we have dinner, just the two of us, like old times. He hesitated, just for a second. Then he said, "I'll have to check." Check. With the woman who now knew his schedule better than I ever had. That word stayed with me longer than it should have. I began choosing my words carefully. I didn't want to seem needy. I didn't want to be the kind of mother people whisper about, the one who can't let go. So I laughed more than I felt. I asked fewer questions. I swallowed moments that hurt, because when a son starts pulling away, a mother doesn't chase. She waits, and in that waiting, I felt something breaking, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that doesn't heal easily. Like realizing you're becoming a memory while still alive. The first time I felt truly out of place, it happened in a room full of people. Family had gathered, laughter, voices overlapping, plates being passed around. It should have felt warm, familiar. Instead, I felt like a guest who had stayed a little too long. I said something harmless, a small comment about how tired my son looked, the way a mother does out of care, not criticism. She corrected me, not sharply, not unkindly, just confidently. "He's been working out," she said, smiling. "He's actually feeling great." My son laughed and nodded. He didn't look at me. It was a small moment, so small that no one else noticed. But something inside me shifted. Later that evening, I pulled him aside. I told him I felt like I didn't recognize him anymore. I asked if everything was okay between us. He sighed, not in frustration, but in exhaustion. "Mom," he said, lowering his voice, "you're reading too much into things." Too much. I wanted to explain, to tell him it wasn't about jealousy or control. It was about absence, about feeling slowly erased. But the words stayed in my throat, because when love starts choosing sides, speaking up feels dangerous. I realized then that my role had changed, but no one had told me the rules. I didn't know how to exist in this new version of his life without becoming a problem. So I did what mothers often do when they feel pushed to the edge. I stepped back. I convinced myself it was temporary. That space would fix what silence had created. That love, real love, would find its way back. But space doesn't always heal. Sometimes it just makes the distance easier to ignore. And that was the night I understood something painful. I wasn't being replaced by accident. I was being replaced politely. The moment that finally broke me didn't come during an argument. It came during a conversation that was supposed to be normal. We were alone in the kitchen, just the two of us. No raised voices. No tension that anyone else could see. I thought maybe this was my chance to reach him again. I told him I missed him. Not in a dramatic way. Not with blame. Just the truth. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, eyes tired. And then he said the sentence that still echoes in my head when the house is quiet. "Mom, she's my family now." He didn't say you aren't. He didn't have to. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument we'd ever had. I smiled. Of course I did. Because mothers learn early how to smile through pain. I nodded, as if he had said something reasonable, logical, mature. But inside, something cracked. I had been his family when he had nothing, when he was scared, when he was sick, when the world didn't make sense. And now, family had become a title with conditions. I wanted to ask him if love really had to replace one person to prove devotion to another. I wanted to ask why loving his wife meant loving me less. But I didn't, because he was already looking at me like someone who needed to understand, not someone who needed to be held. That night, I drove home slowly. I sat in my car long after I parked, staring at the steering wheel, wondering how a word as warm as family could suddenly feel so cold. That was the day I realized I hadn't lost my son in one moment. I was losing him in sentences. After that day, I learned a new skill. Silence. I stopped calling first. Stopped reminding him about birthdays. Stopped offering help that wasn't asked for. Not because I stopped caring, but because I didn't want to be seen as too much. Every message I typed, I reread 3 times before sending. Is this supportive or intrusive? Is this loving or unnecessary? Sometimes I deleted the message entirely. I watched from a distance as his life continued without me at the center. Social media filled in the gaps he no longer explained. Smiling photos, celebrations, new traditions that didn't include my voice or my presence. I told myself this was maturity, that letting go was the final lesson of motherhood. But letting go felt less like peace and more like grief. On holidays, I waited for his call. When it came late or not at all, I told myself not to take it personally. He was busy. He had responsibilities. A wife. Still, the house felt louder in its quiet. I started talking to myself more. Not because I was lonely, because I was trying to remember what my voice sounded like when it wasn't careful. Once, I almost told him how much it hurt. The words sat on my tongue. But then I imagined his response. You're overreacting. This isn't about you. You need to respect my marriage. So I swallowed the truth again. Because when your child treats your pain like an inconvenience, you begin to doubt whether you're allowed to feel it at all. I wasn't angry. I was shrinking. And the hardest part wasn't being pushed aside. It was learning how easily I could disappear without anyone asking where I went. There was a day quiet, ordinary, when I realized how much I had changed. I was standing in the grocery store, holding his favorite cereal. I had reached for it without thinking, the way I had for years. And then it hit me. He didn't eat this anymore, at least not with me. I stood there longer than necessary, staring at the box, feeling foolish. That was when I noticed how small my world had become. My days were measured by absence, my nights by questions I never asked out loud. I began apologizing for things that weren't wrong, for calling at the wrong time, for expressing concern, for missing him. Once, when I finally did say something, when my voice trembled just enough for him to notice, he said, "Mom, you need to stop making this harder than it is." Harder, as if love were supposed to be effortless when it came to me. That night, I looked at myself in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. She looked tired, careful, like someone who had learned to take up less space. I remembered who I used to be, a woman who laughed loudly, who spoke freely, who believed love didn't require permission. Somewhere along the way, I had turned into someone afraid of being replaced completely if I said the wrong thing. That's when it became clear. I wasn't losing my son because he loved his wife. I was losing him because I no longer knew how to exist in his life without being seen as a threat. And the most painful realization of all was this: he didn't notice the parts of me that were disappearing, because to him, I was still there. People talk about acceptance as if it's something gentle, like a deep breath, like relief. But my acceptance came quietly and heavy. I stopped expecting things. That was the first sign. I stopped hoping for calls that didn't come, invitations that never arrived. Hope, I learned, was too painful to carry every day. So I put it down. I told myself this is how it's supposed to be. Sons grow up. Marriages come first. Mothers learn their place. That's what everyone says. But no one talks about what happens to the mother when she finally understands that her role has been reduced to background. I smiled more in public. I said I was proud. I told people my son was happy. And I meant it because I loved him too much to wish him anything else. But at night, when the house was still, I felt the truth settle in. I was grieving someone who was still alive. There was no funeral, no goodbye, no moment where I could say, "This is when I lost you." Just a slow fading. I realized then that acceptance wasn't about understanding his choices. It was about learning to live with the space he left behind. I started filling my days with small routines. Morning walks, quiet dinners, long evenings with the television on, not for noise, but for company. And somewhere between those moments, I made a promise to myself. I would stop waiting to be chosen, because love that has to be earned again and again doesn't feel like love. It feels like survival. And I was tired of surviving in silence. What I learned when he let me go, I didn't confront him. I didn't demand explanations or ask him to choose. Because one day, I understood something that took me a long time to accept. If love has to be begged for, it has already changed. I stopped measuring my worth by how often my phone rang. I stopped waiting for proof that I still mattered. Instead, I began speaking to myself with the kindness I once saved only for him. I reminded myself that raising a son, to love deeply even if that love no longer centers me, was not a failure. It was proof that I did my job. But here is the truth no one likes to say out loud. A wife should be a priority, but a mother should never become invisible. Love does not require erasing the past to honor the present. If you are listening to this and you feel seen, if you are a parent learning how to let go without disappearing, please know this. You are not selfish for missing them. You are not weak for hurting quietly. And you are not replaceable. Sometimes children don't realize what they've lost until life humbles them. And sometimes they never do. But your value was never meant to be decided by their awareness. Take care of your heart. Take care of yourself. And if this story spoke to you, don't walk through it alone. Like this video, subscribe to the Story Soul Haven channel, and stay with us for stories that remind you that your pain has a voice and your love still matters. Good night.